we have a lot of huge problems. We have the nuclear problem in Korea. We have the nuclear problem in Iran. We have, of course, the whole array of problems, each of which, Afghanistan, and so forth. But then we have the financial issues. But they really are issues of the construction of a new world order. That's what this is about.
What is our common bond truly? Freedom!
Our education system, unfortunately, has been taken over. This came out in congressional reports. Although the Congressional Committee to investigate the tax-exempt foundations was squashed in 1954, they did have hearings to find out where and all the money that the philanthropist organizations, what they're doing and what they're doing with this money, and is there any subversive elements, that would be against the principles of the United States, which is life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, etc., so forth and so on. Here's an excerpt from the actual 1953 investigation into the tax-exempt foundation's congressional transcript. The ideology of the National Education Association was stated in 1934 by Willard E. Givens, who at the time was superintendent of schools at Oakland, California, and subsequently became executive secretary of the NEA, a post which he held for 18 years, under the title Education for a New America. In the proceedings of the 72nd annual meeting of the NEA, Givens said in 1934, "This report comes directly from the thinking together of more than 1,000 members of the Department of Superintendents," that's school superintendents. "A dying laissez-faire must be completely destroyed, and all of us, including the owners, must be subjected to a large amount of social control."
My name is Charlotte Thompson-Iserbaid, and I served as Senior Policy Advisor in the United States Department of Education under the Reagan administration, during which I had access to all of the most important documents for the restructuring of not only American education, but global education. And I'm also the author of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, which gets into all of this, gives the background of what I saw not only in the Department of Education, but as a local school board member. I was trained to identify the resistors to the sex ed, drug ed, alcohol ed, suicide ed, death ed, those good, smart Americans who realize that anything that has education hanging off the end of it is probably not what they're looking for. I was trained to identify those good people and to go up against them, and actually to go and try to get them to join us through the group process system, make them feel important, get them on a committee. And when that just blew my mind. I got pretty upset. And luckily, there was a big book that came with the in-service training called Innovations in Education, A Change Agent's Guide. And I was able to take that back home with me. Unbelievable examples of how to con the Christians and different people who are upset with what you're trying to do, how to bring them over to your side. Case studies, true case studies of educators who had put programs in that normally, in a normal American town, nobody would want them. How did they manage to get them in? How did they con the people? And the other thing was, not only was I trained to identify the resistors, I was trained to go to the important people, high profile, highly thought of people in the community, with the Rotary and Chamber of Commerce, Garden Club, you name it, the different groups in our towns. Go to them and convince them of the importance of these new programs like sex ed, drug ed, I just mentioned all of them. and to get them on your side, because when you can get the leadership in a community to go along with it, then the newspaper comes in and says, you know, a committee's been set up with the head of the Rotary and this and that, and they're all getting behind this task force to discuss whether we're going to have a new sex education program. And then when Mary Jones, you know, who ordinarily would think, why would we want to have a sex education program when we don't have any problems with kids having sex or anything? So she might be you know, concerned. She might be one of the resistors. She reads that her best friend, who's the head of the garden club, is on this committee, and she thinks, oh, well, hey, Mary Appleton is on that committee. She's heading it up. It must be okay. So I was taught really how to con the community. They always call everybody by the first name. You have to get very, you know, affectionate with people, and you say, William, you know, I'm so glad you've come to this meeting, and I understand your concerns about this program, because you know, I've had other people, usually it's the really bright people in the community who have these concerns, and would you like to join our group? The original program was funded by what would subsequently become my office. It was funded by the Office of Research in the U.S. Office of Education, because it was funded early on, about the late 60s. Still funded, by the way. And the money went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to a professor by the name of Ronald Havelock. And he was the one that put together the whole training, the whole seminar, the book. And in the back of the book you had, they admitted it, right in the back of the book, they had about 100 major change agents listed from all over the country. Some of them I recognize, some I still don't, but some I do. And so this was a very important project. And it was being, you know, it was being carried out in I'm sure, all over the country, not just where I was. This was in Searsport, Maine, this lovely little town on the coast of Maine, in the school there, where the guy came in, the facilitator, not Professor Havelock, but a facilitator, to train us. And these were good people that were there. You know, they were some of the teachers from my school, where I was on the local school board, principals, etc. Normal-looking Americans. You know, you really ask yourself, they must themselves have reacted very much the way I did. That's why I've always had a lot of understanding for teachers that have to go through this stuff. I didn't have to continue going through it. They've had to, through the years, constant training, retraining, sensitivity training, break their values. Right, no wrong. You've got to have all religions represented, so, you know, tolerant of everything, and because that's the New World disorder, excuse me. Professor Benjamin Bloom is probably the most important behavioral psychologist ever to live. I mean, maybe not quite as much as Pavlov and Skinner, but he really implemented the system in education in the United States. And he was the author of the taxonomy of educational objectives. And I know that doesn't mean much to some. It means a lot to teachers. They know. All teachers have to go through that, Bloom's taxonomy. And just to give you an idea of how blatant they are, Benjamin Bloom said the purpose of education, and I often say this to parents, really, listen to this. You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students. And then he goes on and he says, he defines good teaching, and this is even worse from the parental standpoint, as challenging the student's fixed beliefs. And then, in some of his works that I have, that are in my book, a lot of this stuff is in it.
When he says challenge, does he mean challenge or does he mean change? Change their fixed?
Yeah, through challenging. It's through challenging. You go up against them and you change them. And you asked a good question, because then he goes on in one part of the taxonomy that is in my book, he says that he can take a student from here to there, from a belief in God or his country or whatever, to being an atheist and not believing in his country in 1 hour.
In reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see.
And I've seen it with students. I've seen it with young people. And they don't even know, and teachers don't even know. That's why if you talk to teachers about it often, they'll really have an awfully hard time dealing with it. And if you go up to a superintendent, an educational administrator, superintendent or whatever, and you ask him or her, have you ever been through sensitivity training? They'll usually crack up because they went through it. They're the worst, those programs. I've been through them. I mean, how can anything be worse than some of the ones that the regular classroom has? But they're the worst.
What do they teach the children?
To bring about change. They put them through role-playing, psychodrama, all these psychological techniques where they play the part of starving children, and the other one plays the part of a very wealthy industrialist child. And, you know, they bring about the attitude and value change through the emotions. You know how young people are. You know, they're naturally very altruistic, and they want to help, and they don't like to see poverty around the world. And so what they'll do is, just like I think I mentioned to you earlier, or I don't know whether I did, going into the teacher putting in the new social studies program in our community and walking through, taking the little tots through town and identifying big rich people's houses and small poor people's houses. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Getting them young and making them feel sorry for the people who live in the trailer across from the captain's house because they only eat hot dogs, not steak. And then they'll do the same thing with Ethiopia or wherever, some third world country, showing them the children dying, and then they'll show pictures of our affluence. And what do you eat for breakfast? Oh, you have eggs and bacon and cereal and orange juice and grapefruit and everything. Yum, yum, yum. Do you really think it's fair? Common unity. That's what we call it. Common unity. There's no role for the individual in the community. And for everything that goes on in the Soviet Union or communism is based on the community, the commune.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
I hope this presentation has illustrated what a dangerous road the American people are on. Our children for 3 generations have been influenced by the great foundations who have funded the education system in America. These same foundations have funded the rise of Nazi Germany. These same foundations have funded the Bolshevik Revolution. These same foundations fund public television and private television. These same foundations benefit from the monopolistic control over resources through their benevolent giving. The power behind these foundations founded the UN. It was Thomas Jefferson who said, "A government big enough to give you everything you want is strong enough to take everything you have." Of the NEA, a post which he held for 18 years, under the title Education for a New America. In the proceedings of the 72nd annual meeting of the NEA, Given said in 1934, "This report comes directly from the thinking together of more than 1,000 members of the Department of Superintendents," that's school superintendents, "a dying laissez-faire."
New world order. That's what this is about.
What is our common bond truly? Freedom!
Of the United States, which is life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, etc., so forth and so on. Here's an excerpt from the actual 1953 investigation into the tax-exempt foundation's congressional transcript. The ideology of the National Education Association was stated in 1934 by Willard E. Givens, who at the time was superintendent of schools at Oakland, California, and subsequently became executive secretary. The education system, unfortunately, has been taken over. This came out in congressional reports, and although the Congressional Committee to investigate the tax-exempt foundations was squashed in 1954, they did have hearings to find out where and all the money that the philanthropist organizations, what they're doing and what they're doing with this money, and is there any subversive elements, that would be against the principle.
We have a lot of huge problems. We have the nuclear problem in Korea. We have the nuclear problem in Iran. We have, of course, a whole array of problems, each of which in Afghanistan and so forth. But then we have the financial issues. But they really are issues of the construction of a